online, on the TuneIn app.
And on your smart speaker.
Play Shock Radio.
This is the sound of Salford.
Shock Radio News.
This is your Shock News show with Alfie Garner and Benny Fiddimore. The headlines at 7 o'clock. A taxi driver has been charged with the murder of his 10-year-old daughter, and he says he takes full responsibility for her death. Yafan Shafir denies murdering Sarah at their home in Woking, Surrey last year before fleeing to Pakistan. But he told jurors she was dead because of me, with iron burns and bite marks among her injuries. It has been confirmed that 1,000 jobs are at risk, with more than 100 post office branches potentially closing. Further roles are under threat at its headquarters as the firm looks to streamline back office operations. Failing hospitals in England will be name and shame in a so-called league table. The Health Secretary, Wes Streeting, has also announced plans would see NHS bosses sacked if they can't improve patient care and manage their finances. Thames Water is understood to have agreed a deal with creditors for a £3 billion lifeline. The court still needs to approve the plans. And disgraced news presenter Hugh Edwards will keep his BAFTA awards, but the TV organisation says it's going to change its rules for those who are convicted of serious crimes in the future. So, let's talk about this main story that has been dominating the headlines over the last few days. The Archbishop of Canterbury did resign yesterday. It followed the publication last week of the Making review into barrister John Smith's abuse into children and men. It suggested the church officers, including Justin Welby, could and should be reported to Smith to authorities over a decade ago. Ben, I want to bring in your contextual understanding of this. What does this mean for the Church of England going forward, and how can they recover from this?
I think it's a massive problem for the Church of England from a cultural perspective. When you've got somebody who's leading up the Church of England, who's known or alleged to have known about child abuse that was taking place within that organisation, he sets the standard for the whole organisation. So if it comes from the top, and so if he's there allowing this slip by, to turn a blind eye to this, then it always starts at the top. So the culture within the Church of England is this is acceptable, this is okay, and clearly it's not. So there's definitely cultural damage throughout the whole of the Church of England because of this.
And it's obviously going to be a change of direction because new Archbishop of Canterbury has been in service for 11 years. It now means finding a new person to replace him. But it's not only that, he has such big power, not only in the Church of England, but in other places. It could damage the Church of England's reputation further and going onwards. But it also does bring that sense of shame and sorrow to the organisation. Reverend Stephen Kurt, who's written a book on safeguarding, does say it is important to be vigilant.
When it comes to safeguarding, we've got to be all over it. We've got to, if something smells rotten, we've got to go after it. We've got to persevere until we're absolutely clear that everything has been done that should be done.
It did come as well as the review came after Welby's resignation yesterday, as the Archbishop of Canterbury should just remind you of that. Again, Kurt did say it is important to be vigilant, especially in the Church of England, isn't it?
Yeah, because when he's Archbishop of Canterbury, he has a role, and it's very significant in the whole of the UK, leading the church, because there are so many Christians in the UK who are led by him. So he has to lead by example, and to allow this sort of behaviour to go on in the Church of England, and even the person at the top isn't going to do something about it, then it makes it quite a scary place to be, because there are going to be people who think, who probably actually know as well, if they think that the Archbishop is going to let this slide, well, what other behaviour will he let slide? So I definitely agree with that.
Yeah, just to point out some of the roles, obviously the Archbishop is the spiritual leader. He gets the opinion, obviously, of the Church of England, but he also has a view over like the world of religion as well. He's also Primate of All England, so he's a senior bishop, Metropolitan of the Southern Province, and he also gets a big role in the House of Lords. He gets a lordship, and that's one of the people who will decide policies going through. So it does bring a big change, not only to the Church of England, but also politically. This is why, for a lot of people, this is why it's important, because it's a lord that's getting lost who will replace that lord, and it brings into question whether the lords allowed this behaviour, whether the Lords also encourage this behaviour, doesn't it?
Yeah, it doesn't look good on the Church of England at all. But also you say with his position in the House of Lords, outside of the church in this country, he's a very influential person because he's got so much power from that role as Archbishop of Canterbury. And Justin Welby, in particular, has been very outspoken on several issues during his time as Archbishop. I mean, he was very critical of the Rwanda policy as a specific one. And for somebody in that role, which is supposed to be kind of like a church role, to be making lots of claims as well, it shows he has got influence, and it also puts him into a more public line as well. So people who wouldn't necessarily be interested in the Archbishop of Canterbury, people who aren't religious, are now listening to him and hearing what he's got to say because he has been more outspoken. So he's been an influential person, not just in the Church of England, but in the country as a whole.
Yeah, exactly. And obviously, he will sort of have that idea that he still keeps that power. Obviously, he doesn't now under a title, but he did spend 11 years in service, and it's now come crashing down to a point where he's gone from probably one of the highest powers, especially in the Church of England, to nothing overnight because of all this pressure he was put on by other leaders, wasn't he?
Yeah, I mean, even the Prime Minister refused to back him a couple of days ago. And I think it was the Bishop of Newcastle also said he needed to resign, just as an example. But yeah, bishops across the UK last few days have been saying, you've got to resign, you have to. So yeah, I think his position was untenable. And I'm surprised it actually took so long because there were reports on Monday that he would go. He didn't go. He said he would stay on, and then Tuesday, gone.
Yeah, exactly. Well, let's move on to PMQs because you talked about the Prime Minister Day. Today was PMQs as it is usually on a Wednesday. This is something that Keir Starmer said during the session.
We've been resolute and strong in our support for Ukraine in the face of Russian aggression. And I have been speaking, as he will know, in recent weeks with other leaders about how we put Ukraine in the best and strongest possible position at this time.
So that obviously comes with the support for Ukraine, which has been going on since 2022, since Boris Johnson, then Liz Truss, then Rishi Sunak, now Sir Keir Starmer. But it also comes under question following Donald Trump's election last week. He said that he would finish the war, end the war within 24 hours of being elected president. He now has to fulfill that promise, obviously, in January when he gets sworn in. But is it a chance that Donald Trump will involve himself too much in these wars? And what side would he go on, Benny?
I don't think he'll involve himself in the war specifically. I think, honestly, I believe that he will just withdraw the support for Ukraine on his first day. I don't know that for sure, obviously, and I can't speculate, but that's what I believe will happen because I think Donald Trump is very much of a America first, America only policy, and I think he will do his best to stay out of global conflicts if they don't benefit the US. And clearly, Ukraine, at the end of the day, to America, is just a small country in Europe. They're not so bothered about them. And it's not like in the Cold War where the US's sphere of influence was such a big factor of their government. Trump's more interested in growing the economy in the US. He's not that bothered about Ukraine. So I'd be surprised if he got involved that much, as apart from withdrawing the support for Ukraine, which then obviously means Russia has a massive advantage. I don't think he'll necessarily support Russia. I honestly just think it'll be a case of removing the support for Ukraine militarily. I don't think he'll go out and say, "Oh, we support Russia, we support Ukraine," but I think that's what's going to happen. I think indirectly the US will probably allow Russia to take Ukraine, but obviously we have to wait and see what happens in January. He hasn't made it clear what he's going to do just yet.
Well, you did mention there that the US has such a strong support for Ukraine. They provide a lot of weaponry and military support. So whatever happens, either way, something's going to give, either from Ukraine's side or from Russia's side. But also what it means is because Donald Trump's now in charge, there is that relationship between EU countries who fully support Ukraine and obviously seeing what Donald Trump does in the next 4 years of president, obviously in January, doesn't it?
I think there's the big problem here or the big issue is Donald Trump going to leave NATO or take America out of NATO? And if he does, then the European countries haven't really got a foot to stand on. And even the UK, I mean, we're not big enough to fight on our own. We have to have the support of America. We can't send Ukraine enough support on our own. So if America withdraws, it will be similar to Afghanistan. When America withdrew, we had to withdraw, and I think the same would happen again. I think there'd be a lot of controversy in the UK about that because obviously Boris massively supports Ukraine, and I mean he continues to do so. Says it in Unleashed and has been in his media rounds of recent weeks. That I think the Conservative Party are very much behind Ukraine. So I think it would cause a lot of tension in the House of Commons. But realistically, if Starmer was faced with the fact that Trump has withdrawn from Ukraine, does he really have a choice? I don't think he does.
No. Officials in Kiev are concerned about how Donald Trump's administration will alter policy and relations on the war. Donald Trump has hinted but hasn't confirmed that he does want to stop giving billions in aid to Ukraine. Meanwhile, Ukrainian troops fear a rival in Russia's resolve as a record number of drones have been fired towards Kiev. The US says North Korean soldiers are part of this resurgence in the conflict along the border. What does that mean going forward? Does it mean that we're going to see Ukraine start to give a bit more, or do we think it's just going to be Ukraine's going to have to keep sticking forward and keep going forward with what they're doing at the moment?
It just doesn't seem a war that's going to end anytime soon. It just seems to be dragging, and we still seem to be at a bit of a stalemate. But I don't know. I don't know whether Ukraine will be able to carry on if they don't have the support of the US and maybe subsequently the support of European countries in the UK. So I'm not sure what they can do next. I think for now they've got to just stick at it, try and fight it out with Russia as they have been for nearly 3 years now. But I think the situation will change very radically when we see Donald Trump inaugurated. And I think it will be day one because Trump has made this big promise that he will be a dictator on day one only. So I can imagine that day he does get sworn in and inaugurated again, there'll be several policy changes, foreign policy, economic policy, and I think we'll have a much clearer picture of what's going to go on after that day has happened. I think the inauguration is going to make for a very good news show, to be honest.
Yeah, well, obviously, it also comes as Israel is continuing its war in the Middle East with Lebanon and in Gaza. So there's a lot of heavyweights on Donald Trump's back for when he becomes president in January, because not only does he have to deal with support in Ukraine, whether or not he continues support, we don't know, but he then has to decide whether he supports Israel in continuing its war in the Middle East, or whether or not he wants to say, we're backing out of these, it's not worth it for the American history sort of thing. What do you think is like to happen, and what do you think the impact of that could be?
Now, with Trump, I think he's a very interesting character in these sorts of situations because whilst he says some very controversial stuff, and you think, and lots of the time there's all these rumors when about to get elected, oh, this will result in World War III, whatnot, because he does say extreme things about foreign leaders and nations. In his first term as presidency, what we saw was Trump's aim to try and end wars because, again, he thinks from an economic point of view. And I mean, sometimes war benefits you economically, and I don't know whether we'd see a different side to Trump's foreign policy in a war that does economically benefit the US. But right now, obviously, Ukraine is damaging them economically because they're spending so much money, and it's the same with Israel. And I honestly, I don't know what Trump will do in Israel. I think it's very hard to predict what will happen because obviously Israel is a massive ally to the US, and this is land that Israel have been fighting for a long time with Palestine and Lebanon now. I just think it's hard to say because on the one hand, Trump, he's not particularly a big fan of Middle Eastern leaders and Middle Eastern countries. But at the same time, he was also the one who tried to start that denuclearization program with North Korea. So I think it's very hard to predict. And again, I think we'll see what he says on day one of the presidency, and we'll have a much better idea. But right now, I think it's very unclear.
Yeah, exactly. We can only wait to see what happens. Let's come back though, back home. West Green has said today that alongside the investment that has been put into the NHS during the budget a few weeks ago, it says that it needs major reform.
The work you do couldn't be more serious. When you get it right, lives are saved. When you don't, the consequences can be tragic. If performance dips, I reserve the right to take those freedoms away. And for those judged to be persistently failing, we will act, going from zero consequences for failure to zero tolerance.
So that's him saying that underperforming NHS trusts across England could be named and changed on a so-called league table as part of new government measures. The proposals will also see health service managers sacked if their departments don't improve. It's part of the strategy to reduce the waiting list from 18 months to 18 weeks. What does this mean for the NHS going forward, considering they've just seen a big amount of investment from the government, but it comes with caveats of lots of reform? What does this actually mean for the NHS?
Well, we've had a lot of investment in the NHS, but nothing has seemed to work over the last at least decade or so. So I suppose, yeah, it's time to do something different. The NHS needs a complete restructure, as Wes Streeting has said. Is he going to do that? Is he going to change the way that management works in the NHS? Because you can always chuck money at it, but if you don't have the correct staff, the correct training, the correct infrastructure, then there's not really much you can change. So is he going to? He's going to say to these NHS practices, "Oh, we'll name and shame you if you're failing on waiting lists." But is he going to help them with hospital renovations? Is he going to help them with more beds, ventilators, whatever you need to conduct surgeries and operations? And is he going to also direct the investment in the right places? Is he going to be training more doctors in the regions? I think it's very hard. I think it's quite a taboo subject. I know that Corbyn's come out and said that he's completely against it, saying the NHS is under enough pressure as it is. With now these league tables, it's just going to increase stress on an already struggling workforce and reduce morale and make things even worse. But I kind of see where he's coming from, because obviously the NHS is failing. But I think it's essential that if he is going to go with this plan, he does need to do some reform himself and change the way we use investment in the NHS, change the management structure, change the infrastructure, make sure that hospitals are up to standard so they can deliver the results he's asking for. He can't just expect them at the moment to do that.
Yeah, exactly. But again, it brings up that question which you mentioned before. Is it the right way of getting hospitals to reform properly? Is it right that we publicly name and shame the worst going trusts? Because all it could do is prevent people going to the NHS because they're so worried about the NHS failing them in such a sense that they don't get the proper care that they need, doesn't it?
I think as health secretary, he should be supporting hospitals to improve and get better instead of saying that they're doing rubbish, because I don't think that really helps anyone. I think constructive criticism and positive progress is the way forward for the NHS. We know that it's struggling. We don't need to be told again that trusts are failing. And I think competitiveness in the NHS isn't really right, because this is a health service which is publicly owned and publicly funded. So is it really necessary to be putting hospital trusts up against each other? I don't think so.
Yeah, again, it does bring that question. But also, does it bring the question then of, if there is that competition, will more of them be willing to put in the effort? Or is it going to be, we don't really care because you're still paying us a bunch of money? Because he has said that he will look at a new pay framework for the chief execs, and it will be published in April, which will clamp down on the poor performance. Will the now chief exec see that and be like, we need to put more effort into actually making sure that we are doing the right things for our trust?
Yeah, although I think it's not 100% the right way to go about things. Again, on the other side of the argument, competition could strive NHS trusts to feel inspired and motivate them to deliver a better service. I just think that the negative impact it probably outweighs the positive, but I can see why, because in business, competition results in better services. So maybe that's what Wes Streeting's thinking. Competition will result in better hospital trusts, and I think the chief execs will look at that and think, if we are at the top of the league table, then it looks good on us. So yeah, let's go for it.
There is that, but again, it does bring in that point of, should we be running hospitals as if it was a business? Should we be running these public institutions as if it was a private business that is owned by shareholders? It does
Yeah.
sort of equate the national health to a business that you can get a bunch of profit from, doesn't it?
Well, it's called the NHS, not the NHB, because it's meant to be a service, not a business. So Yeah, I can see why there are positives in this, but I also just think it's not meant to be a market. It's meant to be a public service. So let's focus on making sure it's a public service and improving it, as opposed to trying to set unrealistic targets and further dent what's already a really poor morale amongst workers, because their pay rises haven't been matching inflation until the last few months. So and they're working very hard, very long hours. So everybody's already down as it is in the NHS. So to just further put more pressure on the staff, it should be pressure on the government to actually sort the fundamental issues out, like infrastructure, as I've said before, and staff structures. It's not on the staff, who now will feel under further pressure to deliver when they're already doing so much, because anyone will tell you, most NHS staff who people come into contact with will say they are excellent and they've done an excellent job. That's why the NHS still gets so much praise. It's not the staff in the hospital that's the problem. It's the way the NHS is structured that is the problem. So that's why I think, yeah, I'm not 100% on board with this plan from Wes Streeting here.
And again, you did point out that the infrastructure isn't there for a lot of the hospitals. A lot of them are working out of Victorian hospitals and Victorian buildings that aren't suitable for modern equipment. So it's looking at where can these improvements come that isn't just get a grip, essentially, isn't it?
Yeah, and the other problem is with the government, and it can be Conservative Labour governments. They always think we'll chuck a few billion extra at it a year and it will sort itself out. It won't. It's the culture and the structure, and that's the problem. And for some reason, governments never seem to be able to implement the reform that is really desperately needed. So hopefully this is the beginning of a plan from Wes Streeting to reform the NHS. Again, like we say with everything, we'll have to wait and see what happens, but let's see.
A lot of things to talk about, that's for sure. Let's get a reminder, though, of your headlines today. A taxi driver has been charged with the murder of his 10-year-old daughter, and he says he takes full responsibility for her death. Yafan Shafeen has denied murdering Saha at her home in Woking last year before fleeing to Pakistan, but he told jurors she died because of me, with iron burns and bite marks among her injuries. It has been confirmed that 1,000 jobs are at risk, with more than 100 post office branches potentially closing. Further roles are under threat at its headquarters as the firm looks to streamline back office operations. Failing hospitals in England will be named and shamed in a so-called league table. The Health Secretary, Wes Streeting, has also announced plans that would see the NHS bosses sacked if they can't improve patient care and manage their finances. Thames Water is understood to have agreed a deal with creditors for a £3 billion lifeline. The court still needs to approve this plan. And a disgraced news presenter, Hugh Edwards, will keep his BAFTA awards. The TV and film organisation says it is going to change its rules for those who are convicted of serious crimes in the future. This week's Shock News Show was hosted by Alfie Garner and Benny Fiddimore and was produced by Luke Jones. Alfie Mulcahy was directed by Thomas Sharp. Your news bulletins return tomorrow during breakfast.